Welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar on the Build America, Buy America Act's Buy America preference. This webinar is intended for HUD ESG and CoC grantees. My name is Alexandra LaHood. I am with Enterprise Community Partners, the host for this webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the HUD Exchange with the presentation and transcript. Please note that the participant audio and chat is off. To view closed captions during the webinar, you may click on the CC icon in the controls toolbar. The Q&A function is available. We encourage you to listen to the presentation and enter your questions towards the end of the webinar. We will respond to questions live at the end of the presentation. If your question is not answered, or if you have additional questions, we will provide instructions at the end of the webinar on how to access the new BABA Ask a Question help desk on the HUD Exchange. With that, I'll pass it to our presenters.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Kaufman, and I am a senior advisor in HUD's Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Needs. Thank you all for being here today. I'm also joined by my colleague, Dominique Waters from the Office of Special Needs. So we're excited to be able to present this webinar to you today. We know there are so many questions about the implementation of Buy America, Build America. And I think we will address many of the questions that you have today. I want to remind everyone that CPD Notice 23-12 was posted a couple of weeks ago, and the notice provides implementation guidance for the Buy American preference. There are also a number of great resources on the HUD Exchange, and as these webinars are completed, we will post a recording, a transcript, and a copy of the slides on HUD Exchange. So with that, I will turn things over to our presenters to start the presentation. Thank you all so much.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Happy to be here today with you and with this great team. Clint Whited with the Enterprise Community Partners team. Happy to be here discussing the BAP and BABA requirements with you all today. Our first presenter, and actually to lead us off, will be my colleague, Chris Andrews. So I'm going to toss it to Chris.
Great. Thank you, Clint. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know it's a busy time of year, so thank you for taking time to join us for today's webinar. As Lisa and Clint said, our goal today is to walk you through the requirements for the Buy America preference. Our primary goal, we want to make sure at the end of this session, everyone has a good understanding of what the Buy America preference requirements are and understand how it applies to ESG and CoC grantees. And then we want to review the basic steps that you all should be taking when you implement the BAP. So in our session, we're going to begin by talking through what are the types of projects, what are the types of products that are covered by the regulation, what are the waivers that are already in place, what is the process of implementing the BAP and how to comply with the regulations, and then walk through a couple of different project examples. There was a webinar that was held at the beginning of November that provided an overview of the BAP for CBD programs. That webinar will be posted on the HUD Exchange very soon. If you didn't get a chance to join that live, I do recommend you coming back either the end of this week or beginning next week. It will be posted. So first, what is the Build America, Buy America Act? It was part of the Infrastructure and Investment in Jobs Act that was enacted in November of 2021. Overall purpose of stimulating private sector investment in American manufacturing. And within that, it established the Buy America preference. The Buy America preference requires the iron, steel, construction materials, and manufactured products that are used in any infrastructure project funded with federal dollars must be produced in the United States. And so this is applicable to all federal infrastructure spending. It is not unique to HUD. It's applicable to all federal agencies. So first, we want to take a few minutes to review what types of projects and what types of products are covered by the BAP or the Buy America preference. Projects covered by the BAP can include construction, alteration, maintenance, and repair. So even if the primary purpose of that project is not infrastructure, if any of those 4 activities are taking place, the BAP may apply. The definition of infrastructure included in the Act encompasses a range of public projects, facilities, roads, bridges, and construction, alteration, maintenance, and repair of real property. And anything that's touching that would be covered by the BAP. So more specifically, what are some examples of activities that might be and might not be subject to the BAP? Any rehabilitation, repair, construction of buildings or real property, any construction or rehab or improvements to public facilities, such as shelters. Those are examples of activities that may be subject to the BAP. Activities that might not be subject to the BAP include if it is just acquisition of real property, there's no construction, no rehab taking place, just relocation or demo. Shelter or public facility operating expenses, so where you're just focused on the operation of that shelter, of that facility, and there's no rehab, no maintenance, no improvements being made, that would not be subject to the BAP. Additionally, funding for supportive service providers, short-term payments, be it through homeless prevention or rapid rehousing programs, admin activities, and disaster and emergency response. Those are all types of activities that would not be subject to the BAP. And so what are the products that are covered? The products include iron and steel, construction materials, and manufactured products. So let's go into each of those in a little bit more depth. So iron and steel, what is that? That is an item consisting completely or predominantly of iron, steel, or both iron and steel. Predominantly means the cost of the iron and steel content exceeds 50% of the total cost of all of the item's components. So if 60% of the cost of that product is comprised of iron or steel, that would be covered as an iron or steel product. And so how do you have to comply? All the manufacturing, from the initial melting through the application of any coatings, must occur in the United States. The second product is construction materials. And in the regulations, you'll see construction materials are divided into 2 different categories, specifically listed and not listed. This can include non-ferrous metals, plastic and polymer-based products, composite building materials, lumber, drywall, all falling under construction materials. For any construction material, all manufacturing processes must occur in the United States for that material or product. And finally, the third product is manufactured products. So 2 types of products. First, materials that are developed into a specific form or shape through processing are considered a manufactured product. Items that consist of 2 or more materials that have been combined together through a manufacturing process should also be treated as a manufactured product rather than a construction material. So an example of a plastic frame sliding window would be treated as a manufactured product, while plate glass would be treated as a construction material. So with that, let's move into project planning and thinking about how you make the determination if the Buy America preference applies to your project or activity, or if it doesn't. And so in that determination process, just kind of two tranches of outcomes. First, need to comply with the BAP and make sure that those covered products are following the requirements of being manufactured or produced in the United States. Or you may be able to utilize one of HUD's general waivers and do not need to comply with the BAP requirements. You may be able to obtain a project-specific waiver to exclude a project or a portion of the project from the BAP, or the BAP doesn't apply because the project doesn't meet the definition of an infrastructure project. And again, I think when we're thinking about in the context of ESG and CoC programming, when we're talking about operating costs, when we're talking about a street outreach program or a rapid rehousing program, those would not be an infrastructure project. Right? We're not dealing with real property. And so the BAP would not be applying. So let's kind of put that framework of how you can make that determination into a flowchart. And we'll walk through each of these steps in more detail. But the process would be, step one, are the funds being used for an infrastructure project? If no, the BAP doesn't apply. If yes, do the committed funds include ESG or CoC grants? If no, the BAP doesn't apply as it relates to ESG or CoC. If yes, we'll continue on. Does the project use products that are subject to the BAP? Is it using iron and steel? Is it using construction materials? Is it using manufactured products? If no, the BAP doesn't apply. If yes, we'll continue on. In step 4, did HUD obligate the ESG or the CoC funds on or after the effective date of the BAP? And we'll talk more about those dates in a few minutes. But if that grant agreement was executed with HUD prior to the effective dates of either February 22nd, 2024 or August 23rd, 2024, the BAP wouldn't apply. If yes, then is the project covered in whole or in part by any of the general waivers? If yes, then the BAP doesn't apply. If no, could the project qualify for a project-specific waiver? If yes, then you can consider that project-specific waiver, and we'll talk through the process of how to go about considering that. And if no, then in all likelihood, the BAP is applying to that project. So let's go through each of these steps in a bit more detail. So step number 1, are the funds being used for an infrastructure project? So again, infrastructure, we're talking about construction, repair, maintenance, alteration to facilities, to real property, to buildings. So is that occurring, right? And so in our ESG and CoC landscape, we're most often talking about rehab, maintenance, or reconstruction of buildings or real property, or renovation or repair or construction of a public facility such as a temporary shelter, an emergency shelter, or converting a building into a shelter. If your project is exclusively focused on operating costs or supportive services or essential services, activities tied to homeless prevention or rapid rehousing or street outreach or HMIS or admin, that would not be qualifying as an infrastructure project. So step number 2, do committed funds include ESG or CoC grants? If yes, then we'll continue on. If no, the BAP doesn't apply from an ESG or CoC perspective, but you do have to consider if there are other sources of funds from HUD, if there's block grant money being included, if there is home money or home art money being included, or are there funds from another federal agency? Is there HHS money included? Is there VA money being included? And making sure that if those other funds, you may be subject to the BAP from that other funding stream or from that other agency, and you'll need to verify for each of those federal funding sources. So moving on, step number 3, does the project use any of the covered products that are subject to the BAP? So identify all of the products that are in that infrastructure project. Is there iron or steel? Are there construction materials? Are there manufactured products? Early on in the process, and Clint will talk about this a little bit more, but we recommend working with your contractor, with your subrecipient, with your developer during pre-bid meetings, during construction meetings, to review the scope of work, to review the activities, and identify as early as possible if a covered product will be included, to make sure that you can ensure compliance with the BAP from the get-go of the project. And then step 4, did HUD obligate the ESG or the CoC funds on or after the effective date for the BAP? For ESG and CoC grantees, the BAP takes effect for iron and steel on or after February 22nd, 2024. So that means if you execute your grant agreement with HUD prior to February 22nd, 2024, any activity carried out with those grant funds would not be subject to the BAP. But if you execute that grant agreement after February 22nd, 2024, you would need to ensure that any of those activities being carried out with that grant are complying with the BAP for iron and steel. And then for any grant agreement executed after August 23rd, 2024, that would also include the construction materials, both not listed and specifically listed, and manufactured products. At that point, you are fully complying with the BAP on or after August 23rd. So again, I think just to reiterate, be very careful as you're considering activities, double check when that grant agreement was executed with HUD. So step 5, is the project covered in whole or in part by any of the HUD general waivers? We'll review each waiver. So first is emergency or exigent circumstances. Is there an urgent need to complete the project because of a threat to life, safety, or property? So for example, if you're operating a shelter in the winter in a northern climate, and the water heater breaks or the heating system breaks, and that needs to be replaced quickly, in that instance, you could document needing to use the exigent circumstances waiver to protect the safety, the life, and the property of individuals in that shelter and of the building itself. And you could use this waiver, to document not complying with the BAP. The second general waiver is the de minimis small grants and minor components. And this is broken into 2 different parts. So one is the total cost of the project from all sources of funding, federal, state, local, private, all sources, equal to or less than $250,000? If yes, you can use the de minimis waiver and the BAP would not apply to that project. It can also be applied to a portion of the products used in an infrastructure project if the cumulative cost of those products does not exceed 5% of the total cost of covered products. So if the total cost of covered materials is $500,000 and a certain product can't be easily documented, that it is made with US made materials, then you could use up to 5% or $25,000 and waive that portion of the covered materials from compliance with the BAP. So if there is a specific product that you can't acquire, being US made, or can't document as such, you can use the minor component portion of this waiver for that individual product or subset of products. And then the final general waiver is for tribal recipients. Is the project being funded by a tribal recipient? If yes, the tribal recipient waiver may apply, and the BAP is not required for the project. Moving on to step 6. So could the project qualify for a project-specific waiver? HUD may issue a project-specific waiver if it is determined that a waiver falls into one of 3 primary categories. So public interest, non-availability of materials, or unreasonable cost. These are requested and granted on a case-by-case basis, and it requires consultation and review with OMB's Made in America office. So what do we mean by public interest, non-availability, and unreasonable cost? The public interest would be requiring the use of the American-made product would be inconsistent with the public interest for that project. Non-availability means that the product you need for your specific activity is not produced in the United States in adequate quantities or appropriate quality for use. And then unreasonable cost, the inclusion of the American-made product over a non-American-made product will increase the cost of the overall project, and that's an important distinction, the overall project, not just the covered materials, by more than 25%. So those are the 3 considerations for a project-specific waiver. And if you think you fall into any of those categories, the process for doing it is as follows. Begin by reaching out to CPD BABA at HUD.gov for TA and guidance on the waiver process. You prepare the waiver application and all the supporting information as instructed by HUD, and you submit it to the Build America, Buy America at HUD.gov email. As requested, provide additional information during the review process to proceed with the public comment period and final approval by the Made in America office. All HUD waiver reviews will be posted on the Federal Register and then ultimately posted on the madeinamerica.gov website. For more specific guidance, encourage you all to look at page 19 of CPD Notice 2312. So let's kind of step back, right? We just talked through a lot pretty quickly. So step number 1, are the funds being used for an infrastructure project? Are you impacting real property in some way? Is there construction? Is there alteration? Is there maintenance? Is there rehab? Does the activity include ESG or CoC funds? Does the project use covered products? Is it using iron and steel, construction materials, or manufactured products. Was your HUD grant agreement executed on or before February 22nd, 2024 for applicability of any BAP, or between February 22nd and August 23rd, 2024, in which case you only need to comply with iron and steel, or after August 23rd, 2024, in which case you need to comply with all of the requirements of the Buy America preference. Step 5, are you covered in whole or in part by any of the HUD general waivers, by exigent circumstances, by the de minimis waiver or the tribal recipient waiver? And then finally, could the project qualify for a project-specific waiver? And so as you work through this flowchart for each of your activities, we encourage you to document your thinking in that process, maintain that documentation, and Clint will talk more about this, so that you can keep that paper trail of how you made each determination for each activity, if the BAP does or does not apply to that activity. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Clint to talk through implementation and record keeping.
All right, thanks so much, Chris. Now that we have a better understanding of the steps we should follow to determine if the BAP applies to our ESG and CoC projects, let's talk a little bit more about how to implement what we've learned. So we've seen a lot about how to determine applicability. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about how to document your determination as to whether or not your project is subject to the BAP. And documenting that determination is critical for all projects. Some determinations are easier than others, as Chris walked you through the steps and the considerations. And as always, it's important to follow all established record keeping requirements and maintain good records for all ESG and CoC projects. So to operationalize the BAP requirements locally, you should review existing procurement policies and procedures to ensure that BAP requirements are included in your procurement documents and contracts. BAP contract language is included in the special conditions section of your FY 2023 HUD grant agreements for ESG and CoC. The contract language should be incorporated into all agreements, even if the BAP does not yet apply, because of the phased implementation date that Chris was discussing just earlier. The BAP must be included in all bidding documents, subawards, contracts, and purchase orders for products supplied to complete the work. So we want to start getting this language into our procurement documents and our contracts now, as the BAP becomes applicable based on your project by project determinations. Shifting a little bit into record keeping. Best practice, grantees should follow their standard requirements for record keeping on all ESG and CoC projects. Maintaining detailed compliance documentation that clearly shows how you determine applicability of the BAP and how you implement the BAP requirements is important. Without good documentation, it's not possible to demonstrate compliance when your project is eventually monitored. So maintain good records of your determinations and the compliance documentation, as you always would for all of your ESG and CoC projects. And when we talk about documentation and record keeping, this includes maintaining copies of all written communication with stakeholders about the BAP requirements in your project file. Make sure all of that's in the project file. Document and keep detailed notes on your BAP determination. Does the BAP apply or not, and why? And then also make sure that you're collecting, reviewing, and filing copies of all product certifications for the project as required by BABA, should the BAP apply to your project. Okay, so we've talked a bit about implementation and record keeping. I know that I'm starting to see some good questions come in through the Q&A box. But at this point, let's consider a couple of project examples and shift gears a bit. So I've got a couple project examples that we can apply some of the knowledge from earlier in today's presentation. So our first example is in July of 2024, a grantee awarded a $1 million FY 2024 ESG grant funds obligated by HUD after February 22nd, 2024 for the renovation of an emergency shelter. So we've got renovation of an emergency shelter. They awarded $1 million of FY 24 ESG funds for that project. Does the BAP apply to the project? So we want to think back on the BAP determination process that Chris walked us through earlier. There are a few important things to consider here. First, is this an infrastructure project according to the definition? So the project we have here is renovation of an emergency shelter. Second thing you want to be thinking about is, does the project include iron and steel, manufactured products, or construction materials? You may need to take a close look at CPD Notice 2023-12 to refresh your memory on the two types of construction materials, those that are specifically listed, those that are not listed. So there's some details you want to consider. Is the funding subject to the BAP based on the phased implementation waiver? So checking your dates, making sure your determination is considering the phased implementation dates. And do any of the other waivers apply? So let's take a look at the determination on this example. So what we know is the project's an infrastructure project. The grant funds were obligated after February 22nd, 2024. The project's total budget is $1 million. So yes, the BAP applies to iron and steel on this project. But since the funds were obligated by HUD before August 23rd, 2024, the grantee does not need to ensure BAP compliance for construction materials or manufactured products. That hasn't kicked in yet, just the iron and steel in this example. Let's move into another example. So in September 2024, a grantee awards $1 million in CoC funds obligated by HUD in April of 2025 to provide operations support for a project-based rental assistance facility. Does the BAP apply? So again, as you walk back through your BAP determination process that we discussed earlier, your key questions include, is this an infrastructure project according to the definition? Does it include iron and steel, manufactured products, or construction materials? Is the funding subject to the BAP per phased implementation? Do any of the waivers apply? Any of the other waivers? So it could be exigent circumstances, de minimis, small grants, or tribal recipients. So let's take a look at the answer here. So in this example, the grant fund obligation date and total budget suggest that the BAP may apply. However, because the project does not include or involve construction, alteration, maintenance, or repair of infrastructure, such as building and real property improvements, the BAP does not apply. It's not an infrastructure project. So it looks like we're receiving a few questions over in the Q&A box. We'll have time to address several of those questions live in a couple of minutes. But before we do that, I want to review some of the key takeaways from today's webinar. So first, we learned that the BAP applies to projects that include the construction, alteration, maintenance, and repair of infrastructure. Then we learned that all components necessary to complete an infrastructure project should be classified to identify those items in the project scope to which the BAP applies. Those classifications include iron and steel, construction materials, or manufactured products. Finally, it's important that you review your pipeline of projects, both those currently underway and those that are planned, to identify which projects and materials are subject to the BAP. For more details on each of these items, you can always refer back to the CPD Quick Guide that's posted on HUD Exchange. Also, we strongly encourage you to review the steps in Notice CPD 2023-12 to determine applicability of the BAP at both the project and the product level. So Chris walked us through those steps with the flowchart earlier in this session. It's very helpful. We encourage you to follow those steps for each of your projects and consider each of those factors. Additionally, be sure that you document the process to determine if the BAP applies. So the actual determination should be written And good record keeping dictates that you maintain a copy of that determination in your file so that down the road, folks can understand that at a point in time before the project was implemented, staff looked at BAP applicability and determined whether or not it applied and how it applied. Also, you want to be sure that you're including the BAP language in all your written agreements, contracts, and subawards and material procurement documents. This is going to set you up for success when you ask contractors and material suppliers for their BAP product certifications on the projects in the future. So let's get the language into the contracts, very important at this point. So final key takeaways, we're going to talk about a couple of items here. First is the program-wide general waivers for the BAP. Is keep in mind that these are available and they should factor into your determination on a project-by-project basis. So if there are exigent circumstances and the time spent in complying would affect the health and safety of the public, Chris had the example, heat, winter, people are freezing, sounds exigent, right? That waiver may apply in that situation. So it's a good use of the exigent circumstances waiver. If a project cost is less than $250,000, de minimis waiver applies. So just make sure that you're factoring these things in as you're looking at projects. Finally, phased implementation is spreading the effective dates for the programs and the materials across the next few years. So we talked specifically about a couple of dates for ESG and CoC, but if you administer other HUD CPD grants, take a look at our overview webinars, Chris had mentioned earlier, because different grant funding has different dates. So pay very close attention to phased implementation. That's designed to help assist us as we implement procedures for the BAP. Over on the project specific waiver side, adhering to the BAP would be inconsistent with the public interest. That's your public interest waiver. Covered materials that are not produced in the United States in sufficient and reasonably available quantities or of a satisfactory quality. You can look at non-availability as a potential waiver for those types of materials or products. And then finally, inclusion of a covered material that would increase the cost of the overall project by more than 25%. That's the unreasonable cost project specific waiver. So a lot to sink your teeth into there in terms of waivers. Finally, I'd say that grantees should identify the sources for materials that are made in America as early as possible. Do that at the beginning when you're doing the specifications for the project. This way, you'll know early on if you might need a project or a product specific waiver. So know where your products are coming from, what you're specifying in your construction documents. Be sure to refer to the text of CPD Notice 2023-12 for more information about general waivers and project-specific waivers. So at this time, I'd like to bring Lisa from HUD back in before we move on to Q&A. Lisa, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, thank you so much, Clint and Chris, for the presentation. I definitely want to take a minute to reiterate some of the points that you made in the key takeaways. It is important for ESG and CoC grantees to really evaluate all of your projects and activities to determine if BAP does or does not apply and to make sure that you document that in your project file. Also, secondly, make sure that you are passing down the BAP requirements to your subs, to contractors and vendors. There is language that was included as an addendum in the CPD Notice 2312 that has the language that you can include in any subrecipient agreements. So definitely want to, we've said it before, but definitely want to make sure that we drive you all back to the CPD Notice 23-12 for much more detailed implementation guidance. And if you have questions after today's webinar, please feel free to submit them to the AAQ through the HUD Exchange for additional guidance. We've got some time for questions, but I do want to just set some expectations. There may be questions that we're not able to answer because they are very detailed or project specific or nuanced. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can and provide answers. If we don't get to your question live, please send it to the AAQ because that will be a great resource for us to be able to take the time to dive in and really provide the answer that you all are seeking. So with that, I will turn it back to Clint and we will take your questions. But thank you all for your time today and listening to this presentation.
All right, thanks, Lisa. Okay, let's get into some of the Q&A. Got a question here. This one's a bit of a softball, but I'll answer it. Will the webinar presentation and recording be shared with attendees? And the answer to that is, of course. The webinar presentation, a transcription, and recording will be posted on the HUD Exchange within 1 month following the webinar. Anyone will be able to access it from the new BABA webpage on the HUD Exchange as well. So we're going to be getting all of these materials posted for your reference in the future. Next question coming in, can you confirm the applicability dates from the phased implementation waiver? And I knew you all were going to ask that. So yes, the BAP applies for iron and steel, beginning with ESG and CoC funds from grant agreements obligated on or after February 22nd, 2024. For all other covered products, it's August 23rd, 2024. And as a reminder, the applicability dates are based off of when you execute your grant agreement with HUD. So seeing some more questions come in, I'm going to toss it over to Chris. Chris, do you have a few?
Yeah, so we've gotten a lot of questions asking to clarify what types of activities the BAP does and does not apply to. So the BAP only applies to projects that involve construction, repair, maintenance, or alteration to infrastructure. So this is in the context of ESG and CoC funding, predominantly related to construction, repair, maintenance, or alteration of real property, primarily shelters and permanent housing. We've gotten a number of very specific questions asking about how maintenance included as part of an operating cost budget would be treated. Would recommend look at the definition, kind of in each of those instances, determine if that maintenance is being tied to infrastructure. If you are able to fall under one of the other waivers, I think if you do have follow-up questions on that, and specific questions on that, do encourage, to Lisa's point, to submit an AAQ, where the AAQ team might be able to opine a bit more kind of in the nuance and the specifics that you're asking. But in general, the BAP applies anytime where you're seeing construction, repair, maintenance, alteration, right? Screws going into walls, nails going into walls of real property. And predominantly in the case of ESG CoC, that's anything tied to shelters or permanent housing. Let's see, another question coming in. If a $200,000 ESG project is using iron and steel, is funded with an additional $150,000 in local funding, does the BAP apply to the entire project or just the ESG portion? Great question. Because the total project budget exceeds $250,000, the de minimis and small grants waiver does not apply to that activity, to that project. In this instance, the BAP would apply to the entire project. And this is assuming that those ESG funds were obligated by HUD on or after February 22nd, 2024. But because that total budget, even though it only includes $200,000 in ESG, is exceeding $250,000, the BAP would apply to the entire activity, not just the ESG portion. Clint, do you have other questions?
Yeah, we've got a few more coming in here. So we'll go to this one. If a project is using FY 2022 ESG or CoC funds, but the project started after February 22nd, 2024, does the BAP apply? So folks are thinking about funding they have currently and planned uses in the future. So the applicability date for the BAP is based on the date that the grant agreement was executed, not the date that the project starts. So you have to pay attention to the funding that you're putting into the project. In this instance, because the grant agreement was executed prior to February 22nd, 2024, the BAP would not apply to the project. So pay close attention to the date of the grant agreement of the funds that you're putting into the project. And that's how you want to address phased implementation and dates. So FY22 ESG, that was obligated prior to February 22nd, 2024, the BAP would not apply. I've got another question here. Is there specific subrecipient agreement language for BABA that we should be including in our upcoming 2023-24 agreements? It's a good question. Thinking about our contract language, as we encouraged you to do. Grantees may include the BABA language from their FY23 ESG or CoC grant agreements in any subrecipient agreements to ensure BABA compliance by subrecipients and contractors. So that language is also included as Addendum 3 of CPD Notice 2023-12. So look at your grant agreements for FY23 ESG or CoC. There will be a BABA provision from HUD to you in that agreement. You can take that provision and incorporate it into your subrecipient and contract agreements. And there's also language in the notice. So definitely good resources for contract language. You know, you're taking it straight from HUD, putting it into your contracts. It's a good place to start. So we kick it back over to Chris. Chris, do you have some more additional questions?
I do. So next question, does the Buy America preference apply to contractors and vendors or just subrecipients? The BAP applies to any entity who is carrying out the activity. Be it vendors, contractors, subrecipients, it doesn't matter. The BAP requirements must be included in grant agreements, contracts, and purchase orders for the work being performed or the products being supplied under the federal award. And I think building off of that question, if you have a subrecipient who is then hiring a contractor or a vendor, that subrecipient needs to carry that BAP requirement forward. So that the BAP is being carried out regardless who and in what order a provider is carrying out that activity. So let's see, next question. When determining the de minimis of a project, do we base that amount off of the federal funding for the project or the entire project budgeted amount? Great question. So if the covered BAP materials for a portion of the project comprise no more than 5% of the total cost of covered materials used in that project, not to exceed $1 million, the BAP can be waived for the portion of the project. So I think I gave an example earlier, right, that if the total cost of the covered materials is $500,000, the maximum would be 5% or $25,000. We'll try to put that into an example. A city is using ESG funds for the rehab of a shelter. The total cost of materials used in the project is $1 million. The city is able to source domestic materials for pretty much everything it needs, almost all the materials, but can't find domestically produced product for the emergency exit stairway. And that product costs $20,000. Because that $20,000 is less than 5% of the total cost of covered materials, right? The covered materials in this example was $1 million. The city can use the de minimis and minor component waiver to waive the BAP for that emergency exit stairway. The other materials used in the project still must comply with the BAP, but for that individual product, you are able to waive that through the minor component portion of the de minimis waiver. Let's see, we've got time for a couple more questions before we move to wrap up. So is the BAP only applicable to acquisition, rehab, and construction activities. Again, I want to reiterate the question at the top. I think we're seeing so many questions coming in on this. The BAP is applying anytime where there is construction, rehab, maintenance, or alteration to infrastructure. Need to document compliance with the BAP in each of those instances. You may be able to use a waiver in some or many or all of those, depending on your program structure. But you do need to show that documentation in any of those instances is where it would be applying. And then let's see, kind of a question of, do CoC leads have specific responsibilities related to compliance with the BAP? Short answer, yes, right? You want to make sure the BAP is now a cross-cutting requirement, just like anything in 2 CFR 200, just like anything you'd have in procurement. You'd want to make sure you have a consistent policy and procedure for complying with the BAP, for documenting how you're complying with the BAP, and then monitoring, and ensuring that compliance. So as the lead, you hold that responsibility. Clint, we've got time for 1 or 2 more questions if you've got a few more.
Yeah, just looking through here. There was actually another question on BAP language for procurement policies and CFR citations. So folks are really thinking about getting the procedures updated and getting contract language. So again, for all things BAP and all things BABA for your HUD grants, we're going to refer you back to Notice CPD 2023-12. And there you will find the specific language that you can use in your agreements. And I would lean on that written guidance for all policy making in terms of record keeping, in terms of BAP determinations. Obviously here in the webinars, we're showing you how to do it and how to apply the information in the notice, but definitely rely on the language in the notice as you're writing policy or as you are developing contract language, because that's the primary source right now is Notice CPD 2023-12. Let's see.
Great. I think, Clint, we might be close to time. We're going to move to wrap up. I know there were a few questions we weren't able to get to, or some very specific questions we weren't able to cover here. We'll talk about this more in a second, but if you do have additional questions as you're kind of thinking through today's session or questions that you submitted and we weren't able to get to, please submit them to the AAQ. When you do submit the AAQ, please indicate what grant program you are working with. It just provides more context in terms of understanding the applicability from a waiver process. I do want to, before we hop off, just highlight a number of great resources that have been put out. Encourage everyone to go to the BABA HUD Exchange and babahud.gov site. There are a number of resources on both. There are some very specific questions about waivers. You can review the waivers themselves, read the waiver documentation. You can see CPD Notice 2312. There are also a number of quick guides that are being produced. There's an overview quick guide for all CPD programs, specific quick guides for both ESG and CoC. If you haven't bookmarked them already or memorized them, the citations that you're working with for BABA, it is 2 CFR 184. It is a very quick citation and full of a lot of great information. Encourage you all to go there. 2 CFR 200, 322 is just linking to that 2 CFR 184, but including it kind of in the catch-all of 2 CFR 200. And then, as we've talked about a number of times, we do encourage all of you to look at CPD Notice 2312. In addition to having all of the implementation guidance, there is an FAQ in that document. There's the sample grant agreement language and a number of great resources. There's also a great FAQ on the HUD.gov site, and there will be an FAQ coming in the next few months on the HUD Exchange site. And so with that, if we didn't get to your question again, please submit them on the AAQ. In terms of next steps, I do just want to note the webinars that have happened and those that are coming up. As we've talked about, there was the CPD General, which now does have its materials posted. The CDBG and RHP, which will be posted soon. As been asked about and Clint answered, the ESG and CoC webinar, this webinar will be posted at some point in December. There are webinars for other grant programs. I would encourage everyone to circle the BABA case study webinar on January 31st. In that session, we're just going to be kind of diving into different examples of when and how and in what way the BAP applies to different projects across the universe of CPD programs, and thinking about, how to document compliance and how to ensure appropriate compliance with the BAP and the BABA regulations. So with that, thank you all so much for joining. Really appreciate all your great questions, really appreciate your participation, and we look forward to hearing from you all soon.